Have you ever wondered what was truly required for a woman to survive inside an imperial dynasty that never intended to let her exist as an heir? The official chronicles paint a world of noble courts, refined rituals, and impeccable bloodlines. But behind this polished narrative lies a reality far more brutal than anyone dares to admit. When you look closely at the imperial line of succession, you begin to see the silent architecture of control, where women were positioned as symbols of purity, yet treated as liabilities that needed to be contained. This contradiction shaped entire empires, and the deeper you go, the more disturbing the story becomes. For centuries, political leaders, royal advisors, and chroniclers built an elaborate system designed to erase any woman who threatened the carefully crafted masculine chain of power. They manipulated lineage records, reshaped dynastic myths, and hid uncomfortable details that revealed how often women were closer to the throne than history wants us to believe. The truth is that many imperial daughters were raised under the illusion of privilege while living under constant surveillance, as if their very existence was a political risk. A single rumor about their influence or alliances could mark them as dangerous, and once that label was placed on them, their future was no longer their own. Inside palaces that looked majestic from the outside, fear was an everyday companion. Women with legitimate hereditary claims were kept away from political spaces, subjected to rigid routines, and trapped inside roles that confined their intelligence, ambition, and strategic mind. Their education was carefully filtered, their movements monitored, and their voices dismissed. Yet these restrictions were never recorded as violence. They were disguised as protection, morality, or tradition, and this disguise helped hide generations of oppression under the surface of dynastic pride. When you revisit the fragments that survived, you start to see how much was intentionally removed. Letters, decrees, and personal accounts hint at women who resisted, questioned, and tried to reclaim the authority that was rightfully theirs. The more these traces appear, the clearer it becomes that history was not only written by men, but aggressively edited by them. And if this is what can still be found after centuries of censorship, imagine what was erased completely, leaving behind a distorted image that shaped our understanding of ancient and medieval power. This raises a necessary question for anyone watching. Have you ever noticed how many times powerful women simply disappear from historical narratives without explanation? If this makes you think about how many stories were buried, share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective helps illuminate what was intentionally kept in the shadows. And while you are here, leave a like, and make sure you are subscribed to the channel so you do not miss the unfolding of this investigation. What you are about to uncover may challenge everything you thought you knew about imperial succession, and the next part will take us even deeper into the mechanisms that controlled who could inherit power and who had to be erased. When you step past the polished facade of royal authority and examine how the earliest restrictions emerged, it becomes clear that the exclusion of women from imperial succession was never the result of a single law or a sudden decree. It began quietly, in the shadows of tradition, through decisions made in private chambers, where power circulated among men who feared the unpredictable influence of female heirs. These early prohibitions were not written down, because their strength did not depend on documentation. Their force came from repetition, from whispered expectations, from the constant reinforcement of the belief that a woman ascending to the throne would disrupt the natural order established by those who already held control. Behind these unwritten rules existed a deep anxiety about lineage. A woman, with the ability to form alliances through marriage, could connect two powerful houses in ways no male heir ever could. This possibility frightened those who relied on rigid political boundaries to secure their authority. So instead of allowing women to inherit titles openly, the system evolved to ensure that their bloodline served only one purpose: to produce the next generation of male successors. In this arrangement, daughters were groomed not as potential rulers, but as living instruments of political negotiation, their futures predetermined before they even understood their role within the dynasty. Over time, the idea that women were unsuitable as heirs became so embedded in court culture that it no longer needed justification. It transformed into an unspoken rule, passed down from one ruler to the next, supported by advisors, generals, and religious figures who all had something to gain from maintaining the status quo. These early patterns of exclusion shaped the lives of imperial daughters long before any official text tried to rationalize the practice. Even in the absence of explicit laws, women learned quickly that stepping beyond their assigned place was met with suspicion, resistance, or immediate correction by those guarding the gates of power. While male heirs were encouraged to train in diplomacy, warfare, and statecraft, women were confined to instruction designed to reinforce obedience and silence. This asymmetry did not arise by accident. It was constructed intentionally, ensuring that women lacked the tools that might allow them to challenge the carefully maintained hierarchy. And even when some of them showed extraordinary intellect or political intuition, these qualities were dismissed as dangerous rather than valuable. A woman who understood the mechanics of power was often seen not as an asset to the empire, but as a potential threat to its traditions. Yet the contradiction at the core of this structure is unavoidable. The same courts that claimed women were unfit to lead depended heavily on their presence to secure alliances, legitimize dynasties, and stabilize political tensions. Women were indispensable, and yet systematically denied the authority their lineage could have granted them. This paradox defined the earliest stages of succession, creating a silent tension that shaped generations of royal families. And the deeper you explore these origins, the more you realize that the exclusion of women was less about ability and far more about preserving a network of control that benefited those already seated on the throne. As this hidden architecture continued to strengthen, the consequences for women in imperial bloodlines became increasingly severe. And understanding these early mechanisms is essential to grasp how later generations faced even harsher forms of erasure and manipulation, woven into the very structure of the empires they were born to uphold. As the unwritten prohibitions solidified, something even darker began to take shape. The idea that an imperial daughter with a legitimate claim was not simply unsuitable, but inherently dangerous. Once this belief took root, the treatment of these women shifted dramatically. It was no longer enough to keep them at a distance from political decisions. Now they were monitored as potential threats, whose very existence could destabilize the balance of power. Court officials, advisors, and even members of their own families viewed them through the lens of suspicion, fearing that any connection they formed could spark rivalries or inspire factions willing to challenge the established order. This fear was not imagined. History offers countless hints that powerful families, rival noble houses, and aspiring generals often looked to women in the imperial bloodline as pathways to legitimacy. A marriage, a child, or even a rumor of political influence could reshape alliances overnight. For those who desired control, this possibility had to be neutralized. And so these women were increasingly confined, not for their safety, but for the protection of male authority. Their lives became carefully orchestrated performances where every interaction, conversation, or movement was observed by those intent on preventing any shift in the delicate hierarchy that kept the empire stable. The weight of expectation placed upon them was suffocating. They were required to embody grace and obedience, while simultaneously carrying the burden of political significance. Yet this significance was never acknowledged openly. Instead, it lingered in the shadows, shaping decisions that molded their futures without their consent. If an imperial daughter displayed unusual intelligence or ambition, it was quickly framed as a flaw. A curious mind could be interpreted as a sign that she might question the systems designed to restrain her. A desire for education or influence could trigger deeper fears that she might attempt to assert her hereditary rights. The consequences of being labeled dangerous were often devastating. A daughter considered a political threat could be married off hastily to a distant ally, sent into isolation under the pretext of religious devotion, or removed from public life entirely. These decisions were rarely justified openly, but their effects were unmistakable. By taking away their agency, the empire ensured that their potential claims to power faded quietly into obscurity. And because these actions were hidden beneath layers of tradition and moral reasoning, they were seldom recorded as acts of control. They were portrayed as wise, protective choices meant to uphold harmony within the realm. In many accounts that survived, you can sense the tension between the visible facade of respect and the invisible structure of domination. Letters written by royal women reveal their awareness of the forces working against them, even if they could not challenge them directly. Some attempted subtle resistance, forming intellectual circles, influencing cultural development, or building alliances through quiet diplomacy. But these actions were often erased from official narratives, leaving only fragmented traces of lives shaped by fear, restraint, and the constant threat of being used as pawns in political struggles. What becomes clear is that the imperial system was built not just to exclude women, but to ensure that any woman with a legitimate claim would be controlled or silenced long before she posed a real challenge. The further this belief spread, the harsher the strategies became to maintain the illusion of a stable, male-dominated succession. And as these practices deepened, the mechanisms of erasure expanded far beyond what the earliest rulers could have imagined, setting the stage for even more severe distortions of power that would define the centuries to come. As the belief that imperial daughters were political risks intensified, those who controlled the official narrative began using a far more subtle and devastating tool: erasure. Not the dramatic kind seen in executions or exile, but an erasure performed with ink, parchment, and authority. Chroniclers, monks, advisors, and record keepers quietly reshaped history by deciding which stories deserved to survive and which ones would be silenced. When female members of a dynasty displayed intelligence, influence, or political strategy, these qualities were often omitted entirely, replaced by vague descriptions that reduced them to passive figures defined only by marriage, childbirth, or obedience. What could not be removed was softened until it lost all meaning. Year after year, this silent editing created a distorted memory of the imperial line. Names disappeared from genealogies. Deeds were attributed to male relatives. Letters written by women were recopied without signatures, as if their ideas floated anonymously through the palace. Entire events involving female leadership were reframed as collective decisions made by councils of men. And because the chroniclers were often affiliated with religious or political institutions that benefited from supporting male dominance, their alterations carried the weight of absolute truth. Once these modified accounts became part of the imperial archives, there was little anyone could do to challenge them. This manipulation went far beyond simple omission. In many cases, the very traits that made a woman a strong potential ruler were transformed into moral flaws in the official texts. A woman who negotiated alliances became described as manipulative. A woman who engaged in diplomacy was portrayed as deceitful. A woman who studied governance or philosophy was framed as overstepping her place. These depictions shaped public perception for generations, ensuring that any sign of female authority was remembered not as legitimate leadership, but as dangerous ambition. Over time, these narratives hardened into cultural truths that seemed too deeply rooted to question. Inside libraries and monastic scriptoria, scribes held astonishing power over memory itself. They decided which documents to preserve, which to discard, and which to alter. In some regions, female names were deliberately written smaller, placed at the margins, or squeezed between male relatives, symbolically compressing their space within the historical record. In others, women were mentioned only as daughters or wives, never as individuals with agency or influence. And once a woman's story was reduced to these narrow identities, the next generation of historians had even less material to reconstruct her presence. deepening the erasure indefinitely. Despite this, faint traces remain in private letters, foreign chronicles, diplomatic notes, and accounts written outside the imperial circle. These fragments reveal how widespread the manipulation truly was. They also expose the fear that drove it, fear that women could challenge the carefully constructed narrative of succession if their achievements were allowed to stand. By controlling the written record, rulers controlled the future, shaping how later generations would interpret authority, legitimacy, and power. This ongoing distortion did more than hide individual women. It created a long-lasting illusion that empires functioned solely through male leadership, reinforcing the belief that female rule was unnatural or destabilizing. And the more these edited narratives circulated, the harder it became for anyone to see what had been intentionally removed. As the imperial record became increasingly distorted, the system found a new way to neutralize any woman who possessed a legitimate hereditary right. She was quietly removed from the line of succession before her claim could even be acknowledged. These women, often born into the highest ranks of nobility, were never formally accused of wrongdoing. There was no need. Their bow and exclusion happened long before the public ever had a chance to imagine them as rulers. It happened through calculated marriage arrangements, forced retreats from political life, and the subtle rewriting of genealogies that repositioned them just far enough outside the center of power to make their inheritance seem implausible. The process was so smooth, so controlled, that most people never realized it had taken place. In many dynasties, there existed a pattern. When a woman showed exceptional promise, diplomatic skill, or a strong temperament suited to leadership, decisions around her life became more restrictive. Advisors intensified their watch, ensuring that she remained surrounded by individuals loyal to the male hierarchy. Tutors were chosen to limit her exposure to political strategy, while companions were selected to reinforce obedience rather than critical thought. The intention was not simply to prevent her from ruling, but to prevent her from imagining the possibility at all. By shaping her environment, the court shaped the boundaries of her destiny. For some, being deemed unsuitable for succession meant being married off to distant families, far from the central court where influence circulated. These marriages were often framed as politically beneficial, but their true purpose was to relocate potential claimants to places where their presence would no longer disrupt the established order. Once they were gone, chroniclers recorded their departure as a natural step in the progression of dynastic alliances. Over time, these women disappeared from the official story, remembered only in relation to the men they married, effectively severing their ties to the throne they were born to inherit. Others faced a different fate. In certain empires, young women with strong intellectual or strategic abilities were placed in religious institutions under the guise of spiritual devotion. This practice allowed rulers to remove them from the political sphere without raising suspicion or opposition. Cloistered within monastic walls, their lineage no longer threatened the succession. And because their isolation was presented as virtuous, even admirable, it masked the reality that they had been stripped of their birthright. Their letters, if they survived, speak of an internal struggle between imposed duty and the lingering awareness of what they might have been allowed to become. Even when a woman remained physically within the palace, her claim could be undone through the erosion of memory itself. Names could be shifted in family trees, birth orders rearranged, or connections obscured. Sometimes the removal was as simple as omitting her title in documents that mattered. A missing line in a decree, a changed phrase in a succession list, or a deliberate misinterpretation of inheritance laws ensured that she would never be considered a true contender. The changes were subtle enough to avoid immediate attention, but powerful enough to alter the course of dynastic history. What is most striking is how consistently these methods appear across time and across different cultures. The specifics varied, but the intention remained the same: to protect the illusion of an unbroken male lineage by ensuring that no woman with a rightful claim could ever pose a legitimate challenge. As more of these stories emerge from fragments and overlooked sources, the extent of this suppression becomes impossible to ignore. And understanding the mechanisms behind these quiet eliminations is essential for recognizing the deeper structures of power that shaped imperial history long before the public ever saw its final form. As the strategies for removing women from succession became more refined, the empire began relying on methods that went far beyond political decisions or quiet erasure. Controlling a woman's future often required controlling her body, her relationships, and the environment around her. For many imperial daughters, the price of their lineage was a life shaped by coercion disguised as duty. Some endured marriages arranged not to strengthen alliances, but to bind them to men chosen specifically to limit their independence. These unions were designed to absorb their influence, redirect their loyalty, and anchor them in positions that prevented them from exercising any authority beyond what the court permitted. In countless accounts, you can see how these women were treated less as heirs and more as assets that needed to be secured. Their marriages were arranged with remarkable speed, sometimes negotiated before they even reached adulthood. Once married, their movements were monitored through networks of servants, guards, or advisors who reported directly to the ruling circle. A husband loyal to the central authority served as the final barrier to any potential challenge she might raise in the future. If she showed signs of asserting her identity or forming alliances of her own, her freedom was tightened further, often justified in the name of stability or family honor. Other women suffered a darker fate. When marriages failed to neutralize a potential heir, harsher measures were employed. Exile, though rarely described as such, became a convenient tool. Some noble women were relocated to distant estates or border regions, separated from the political core of the empire. These places were presented as peaceful retreats or places of recovery, but in reality, they functioned as elegant prisons where their influence could not reach. Letters from these isolated women reveal a profound awareness of their situation, describing lives spent under constant watch, surrounded by people chosen not for companionship, but for control. Even more troubling are the documented cases of physical coercion. While often masked by the language of discipline or moral correction, these practices served a clear purpose: to break the will of women who resisted the roles imposed on them. There are fragmented reports of confinement, forced medical treatments, ritualized punishments, and even torture used to suppress defiance. These acts were rarely public, carried out instead in secluded rooms or remote estates where witnesses could be controlled. The secrecy ensured both the preservation of the dynasty's reputation and the silencing of those who suffered. And then there were the strategies of psychological manipulation. Imperial daughters were raised in environments where loyalty, fear, and obedience were intertwined. From an early age, they were taught that stepping outside their role could endanger not only themselves, but their families and the stability of the realm. This conditioning created deep internal conflicts. Many learned to suppress their curiosity, ambition, or strategic thinking to avoid punishment or suspicion. Their silence became a survival mechanism, reinforced by a court culture that praised submissiveness while quietly punishing any sign of independence. The most unsettling aspect of this system was how normal it appeared from the outside. To the public, these women were portrayed as cherished members of the imperial family, gracefully fulfilling their duties. Their suffering remained hidden behind walls of protocol and ceremony. The empire crafted an image of harmony that masked a system built on coercion, sacrifice, and the constant fear of defying an invisible boundary that had been imposed upon them since birth. And the more deeply these practices became embedded in the culture of the court, the more permanent the exclusion of women from true power became, shaping not only their lives, but the future of the empire itself. As the empire perfected its strategies of control, a larger truth began to emerge behind every decision that shaped the lives of imperial women. Exclusion was never merely a cultural tradition or a matter of inheritance. It was part of a vast, deliberate machine designed to protect a political structure that viewed female authority as a direct threat to its survival. Beneath the rituals, the ceremonies, and the language of propriety existed a system built on fear. Fear that a woman with intelligence and lineage could alter alliances. Fear that she could expose weaknesses within the ruling order. Fear that her leadership might challenge centuries of assumptions about who had the right to wield power. This fear influenced every layer of governance. Councils of advisors created policies that, on the surface, seemed rooted in morality or custom, yet each one tightened the circle around women born into noble blood. Religious leaders reinforced narratives about virtue and obedience that conveniently aligned with the interests of the ruling elite. Military commanders insisted that stability depended on male succession, knowing that their influence was tied to the maintenance of that belief. The entire political network functioned like an intricate mechanism, where each part supported the next, ensuring that women remained on the margins, even when they held legitimate claims to the throne. Inside this structure, even the smallest gesture from a woman of imperial descent was scrutinized. A conversation with the wrong ambassador, a close relationship with a scholar, or simply displaying strategic insight could trigger suspicion. The court feared not just what these women might do, but what they might inspire. A single alliance formed through marriage or loyalty could create a faction capable of shifting the balance of power. The machinery of the empire worked tirelessly to prevent this possibility, intercepting relationships, controlling correspondence, and reshaping narratives before they could gain influence. This web of control stretched far beyond individual lives. It influenced laws, shaped diplomatic strategy, and even guided military campaigns. Decisions about alliances were made not only to strengthen borders, but to ensure that no external power could leverage a woman's lineage to claim legitimacy within the empire. In some cases, wars were sparked or avoided because of marriages that might grant a foreign ruler a link to the succession. The political structure viewed every woman in the imperial family not as a person, but as a potential gateway through which influence could flow, intentionally or not. What makes this system even more disturbing is how efficiently it adapted over time. When social structures evolved, it evolved with them. When cultural narratives shifted, new justifications emerged to preserve the same outcome. Even when a woman proved herself capable of leadership, the political machine reinterpreted her strengths as threats. A strategic mind was labeled cunning. A strong will was framed as instability. A desire to participate in state affairs was portrayed as ambition unbecoming of her role. These distortions ensured that no matter how the world changed around the empire, its internal logic remained intact, continually reinforcing the exclusion of female power. And yet, despite the system's overwhelming force, traces of resistance remained. Quiet acts of defiance, hidden alliances, intellectual gatherings, and unrecorded influence found ways to survive between the lines of official history. These fragments reveal the presence of women who understood the machinery working against them and attempted, in whatever way they could, to navigate around it. As the political machinery refined its methods of control, it began to lean heavily on one of the most enduring and manipulative tools of power: narrative. By shaping the story told about female members of imperial families, the ruling elite could justify almost any restriction placed upon them. One of the most effective narratives constructed during this period was the claim that women needed protection, a concept that appeared benevolent on the surface, yet concealed a profound strategy of domination. This idea was repeated so consistently by so many figures of authority that it eventually hardened into cultural truth, accepted without question. The notion of protection created a paradox that trapped women in a carefully controlled space. They were portrayed as fragile, morally pure, spiritually delicate, and therefore unsuited for the harsh realities of leadership. Court philosophers and religious authorities insisted that the world of governance was too corrupt, too violent, or too morally demanding for a woman to navigate. At the same time, these same voices quietly ensured that women remained surrounded by situations engineered to keep them powerless. By convincing the public that restrictions were for their own good, the empire hid the reality that these limitations served only to preserve the dominance of those already in control. The narrative of protection also offered a convenient explanation for why women were excluded from education and statecraft. It claimed that their innocence would be compromised by exposure to political conflict, diplomatic tension, or military strategy. So instead of teaching them the skills that could grant independence, imperial tutors focused on obedience, etiquette, and devotion. The empire restricted their access to knowledge, and then pointed to their lack of training as proof that they were unfit to rule. This cycle ensured that even the most capable women appeared unprepared, when in truth, it was the system itself that engineered their limitations. In diplomatic matters, this narrative became a powerful justification for manipulating marriages. Advisors framed arranged unions as protective measures that would keep women secure under the guidance of men deemed capable of safeguarding their interests. In reality, these marriages transferred control from the imperial court to husbands who were loyal to the political hierarchy. Once married, a woman's lineage could be redirected strategically, her potential influence diffused before it had any chance to take shape. And because this transfer of authority was framed as a natural, even virtuous step, few questioned the deeper motivations behind it. The idea of protection also shaped public perception. Common citizens, exposed only to official accounts, saw the restrictions placed on imperial women as acts of care rather than mechanisms of containment. Festivals, ceremonies, and public appearances emphasized their grace and purity, constructing an image that reinforced the belief that they belonged in a separate sphere, removed from governance. By elevating them symbolically, the empire concealed how tightly it controlled their actual lives. The more revered their symbolic role became, the easier it was to deny them practical power without raising suspicion or resistance. Even in private, the narrative followed them. Women were encouraged to internalize the belief that stepping beyond their assigned role was not only rebellious, but dangerous, for themselves and for the stability of the realm. Letters from isolated estates and monastic retreats reveal the emotional weight of this imposed identity. Many wrote of longing to participate in the affairs of their empire, yet felt bound by a moral framework that labeled ambition as improper. This psychological constraint was as powerful as any physical barrier, ensuring that most women never openly challenged the roles imposed upon them. What makes this narrative especially insidious is how adaptable it proved to be. Whenever a woman demonstrated intelligence, initiative, or political insight, the system reinterpreted these qualities not as strengths, but as vulnerabilities that required even stricter protection. And by masking its intentions behind virtue, the empire created a structure so deeply embedded in cultural values that it became indistinguishable from tradition itself, shaping the lives of countless women long before they ever understood the limits placed upon them. As the narrative of protection solidified into an unquestioned truth, another consequence began to unfold quietly across generations. The cost of erasing women from positions of authority did not end with their exclusion. It created a profound void in the empire's intellectual, cultural, and political development. Every time a potential female leader was removed from succession, an entire dimension of thought, strategy, and perspective vanished with her. These losses accumulated slowly, almost imperceptibly, until they reshaped the very structure of the empire itself. What remained was a system that believed it functioned at full strength while unknowingly operating with only half of its potential. Foreign accounts, untouched by imperial censorship, describe moments where female insight altered the trajectory of negotiations, prevented conflicts, strengthened alliances, or redirected political crises. Yet inside the empire, these same contributions were either attributed to male advisors or simply deleted from the historical record. This knot, only robbed women of recognition, but denied the empire the opportunity to learn from its own complexities. Leadership became defined by repetition rather than innovation, shaped by a narrow understanding of governance that resisted any influence beyond its rigid boundaries. Over time, the absence of women from official memory created a new, unintended problem. The empire lost the ability to imagine female leadership altogether. As generations grew up surrounded by narratives that depicted governance as exclusively male, the possibility of women participating in statecraft became unthinkable. Even when the empire faced crises that required adaptive thinking, it remained trapped in a structure that dismissed half of its population as incapable of contributing. This rigidity weakened its political resilience, leaving leaders unable to recognize or utilize the intelligence that existed within the very families they claimed to protect. The cultural impact was equally profound. Women were expected to embody ideals of purity and silence, yet these ideals contradicted the realities of court life, where complexities demanded discernment, resilience, and intellectual agility. The gap between expectation and reality created psychological fractures within the imperial household. Daughters learned early that their potential could be seen as dangerous. Sons grew up believing that authority required distance from feminine influence. Together, these beliefs perpetuated a cycle of emotional detachment that permeated the ruling class, shaping not only political behavior, but personal relationships as well. Beyond the palace walls, the consequences echoed throughout society. When the empire erased women from its leadership and historical narratives, it sent a message that their voices held little value in public life. This belief extended into law, economics, education, and family structure. The exclusion that began with dynastic control radiated outward, convincing communities that female insight belonged in private spaces, not public ones. Entire fields of knowledge became dominated by assumptions formed in royal courts centuries earlier, reinforcing biases that would shape the lives of millions. And yet, despite these constraints, traces of female influence survived in unexpected places. They appear in artistic expressions, in coded letters, in foreign treaties, and in the private writings of ambassadors who observed what the empire tried to conceal. These fragments show that women continued to shape culture and diplomacy even from the margins. Their influence persisted, though the empire refused to acknowledge it. Each surviving piece offers a glimpse into the possibilities that were lost, revealing how much richer and more resilient the empire might have been had it embraced the leadership it worked so hard to silence. As these fragments surface, they reveal not just the presence of forgotten women, but the magnitude of their absence. They expose a structure built on fear of what female leadership could become, and they highlight the cost of centuries spent defending that fear instead of confronting it. And the deeper we examine the shadow left behind, the more clearly we begin to understand the fragile foundation upon which the empire's version of power was built. By the time we reach the final generations of this imperial line, the effects of centuries of exclusion and manipulation are unmistakable. The system had perfected its control mechanisms, embedding them so deeply in culture, law, and perception that women were largely invisible in the corridors of power. Their potential was known, feared, and methodically suppressed. Yet, even in these shadowed corners, evidence of resilience and subtle influence persists, hidden in documents, letters, and fragments that survived censorship. These traces remind us that the absence of women from historical records was not an absence of capacity. It was the result of deliberate, systemic effort. The stories we uncover today reveal the devastating consequences of controlling who could inherit authority. Entire political strategies, alliances, and diplomatic victories were shaped by the absence of female voices, creating an empire that often operated in half measures, unaware of the insight it had actively suppressed. At the same time, women who survived within this environment developed an acute understanding of manipulation, influence, and subtle power, navigating a court designed to neutralize them while still leaving marks of intelligence and resilience that could not be fully erased. Their lives became exercises in careful calculation, courage, and endurance. Despite the centuries of erasure, their presence echoes in unexpected ways. Scholars rediscover letters that hint at negotiations women conducted quietly, treaties influenced by their insight, and cultural shifts guided by decisions made under their observation. These fragments form a narrative of persistence, demonstrating that power cannot be fully contained when intelligence and strategy exist, even in the margins. It is a reminder that history as written is never complete, and that the legacy of those silenced often survives in ways invisible to the dominant narrative. As we reflect on the scope of this manipulation, it becomes clear that understanding the history of female exclusion in imperial succession is not merely an academic exercise. It offers profound insights into the structures of power, the strategies of control, and the resilience required to navigate systems built to erase entire lineages. Each recovered fragment, each surviving record, challenges assumptions and demands that we reconsider the way we understand governance, legitimacy, and leadership. If you followed this exploration, take a moment to think about what it means when generations of potential leaders were silenced, reshaped, and erased, and then leave a comment letting us know your thoughts, whether it made you reconsider the power of women in history, or how these patterns might still echo in modern institutions. While you're here, make sure you're subscribed so you won't miss the next deep dive into hidden histories and forgotten truths. And if you want to continue uncovering the stories history tried to erase, there's another video waiting for you that will expand on these revelations, revealing even more about the ways power has shaped who is allowed to lead and who is forced to remain invisible.